Hi, everyone. I'm Frank Mallicoat. I work at KTVU Fox 2 here in the San Francisco Bay Area. My guest is the CEO of Restaurant Solutions, a consulting firm that has some sage advice for restaurants that are struggling during the pandemic. Let's say hi to Matt Vannini. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Good afternoon, Frank. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, there's a lot of restaurants here in San Francisco. It's a bit of a ghost town. Some have shut down their doors for good. Others are struggling. They're serving outside, no inside dining just yet. What is priority number one right now? What do you tell restaurants just right out of the gate? What do you need to do?
Right now, out of the gate, the most important facet of understanding how to navigate through the pandemic and have the most options available to you is you have to understand the revenue that's generated per seat. Now, for most restaurant folks, this might get a little technical, but to keep it very light, the way that we look at our revenue and predictable revenue is typically we take a look at the total square footage of our restaurants and we say, oh, okay, I have this many guests coming in times the total square footage of the restaurant. This will give me a basic calculation for top line revenue. The reason that that doesn't work right now is because we are limited to either no inside diners, such as California, or some amalgamation of reopening, whether it's 25, 50, 75%. So it's so critical that we understand how much money is generated from each seat in that business, because understanding that allows us the ability to understand how much revenue we need to make up. So very simply put, if we have a 50% dining capacity, we're not going to only have 50% of the predictable revenue. We are actually going to have about 70% less, so 30% revenue. So it's got to be made up in other places. And whether or not you've heard the phrase ghost kitchens or digital kitchens or marketplace facilitators, which is what DoorDash and Grubhub and the third-party delivery services are being called, we've got to be very creative. But in order to be creative, we have to know, we got to put a face to that boogeyman. We have to know how much revenue we need to make up by the lack of diners in the business. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I imagine there's some restaurants out there that say, we can't do it. I mean,
Yeah.
We're cut down to 25% or 50%, which would be good. Some restaurants that don't have a big area, maybe they can't make ends meet.
And that's why the revenue generated per seat is so important, because otherwise you're eyeballing it. And here's a simple example. If I have a restaurant that normally had, let's say 150 seats, and they cut that restaurant down to 75 seats, it's not the 75 seats that I'm worried about. It's what is the revenue that can be generated from those 75 seats, because the revenue is what we take to the bank, right? I mean, obviously it's the money generator from that. So if you're, for example, if you're a sandwich shop and you have 75 seats that are left in your sandwich shop, and you can make those meals very in a quick fashion, and they can be delivered properly, you're going to have a better chance at survival than, let's say, you've got a farm-to-table restaurant and it's going to take you longer to prepare the meals, and now you're cut down to a very intimate dining segment. It's going to give you that determination whether you should open that dining room at all or focus 100% of your strategy on exclusively using third-party delivery services or some other means of getting your product out.
So you're really going to put your energy and your time into methods that are going to create customers coming in and making some revenue. Because, I kind of look at restaurateurs, and we were talking off camera. I go back a few years in restaurants as well. Is it food or finances? I mean, the patron doesn't care about the finances.
No.
When the food's good, they'll keep coming back. But that's changed a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's really fascinating that you say that, and in a good way, because finances, unfortunately, for most restaurateurs are secondary in their nature. They're very creative human beings, which thank God they are, because they kick out some incredible food and cuisines. But at the end of the day, money is what we're taking to the bank, and understanding. Let me back up for a quick second. The only experience that every restaurateur has collectively to the pandemic is when they open their restaurants for the very first time. Think about it. They didn't have a brand. They had a conceptual knowledge of what they could expect for a guest, the frequency of the guest to come in. But there was a lot of unknown. We're in that same exact position right now. There's a lot of unknown. We don't know when the restaurants are going to be reopened to, let's call it 75 or 100% capacity. We don't know the date that that's going to happen. We know that there's a looming winter that's coming our way. So at the end of the day, what we have to do is what we should have done when we first started our businesses. We have to have a sense of a budget. We have to have a sense of our capacity to earn revenue. And unless you have that set, you're really flying in a worse position, because then you've got hope. And as we know from every movie that quotes it, hope is not a strategy.
Right. And we've seen it firsthand. Another
Yeah.
problem out here, and I know you're based in Denver, but is the weather. Some restaurants can open up outside. They may have a patio or something like that, which is great. And maybe you're doing 50% of your house out
Yep.
there. But I mean, it's going to be 110 degrees inland this weekend in the Bay Area, and no one's going to go out and eat in that kind of area. And then eventually the rain's going to come too. So they're kind of up against it here in California, at least in Northern California.
No, you're 100% right. I've got our size clients that we perform accounting and bookkeeping services for around the country. And so we're dealing with this regionally, obviously. The Pacific Northwest is whether it's California, Oregon, or Washington, we're very sensitive to the fact that, once the rains come and once the weather cools down, outdoor dining, it becomes an investment. What can you do to provide an experience for your guests? And that's where most of the operators live. They want to provide a cohesive experience, and this disparate strategy is really, it's creating more harm than good as far as the brands go. That's why I go back and I say where we started is understanding how much revenue that you can drive off of your business at the current government mandated capacity levels will allow you the opportunity to say, okay, look, it's better for me in this scenario not to reopen the interior dining of my business. I'm going to focus on a strategy that now is a digital strategy, or it is a delivery first set strategy. And then you can spend your time finding the right partners. Do I have the right point of sale system that will allow me to market to third-party facilitators like a DoorDash or Grubhub or Uber Eats or Postmates or Caviar, whatever you want to use. Secondly, what does my packaging look like? So many operators have gotten an education in the last 12 weeks about the packaging is an extension of their brand. If you have a fine dining restaurant and you're selling steaks, let's say, and you're putting them in packaging that is typically reserved for sandwich shops, that's probably not going to represent your brand well. So spend the money, make the right investment into those items so that the guest, when they receive your product, and really, let's take a step back. For most of us as consumers, we want a little bit of normalcy. So we're going to our favorite places. We understand completely that the experience that we're getting at home is the best experience that we can have. It's that one connection that drives us. We might not be in the restaurant, but you're still our favorite restaurant. So if you can represent that product in our home kitchens well, you're going to do just fine as far as the brand equity that you're still building.
Well, you brought up a good point too. I spoke with Rodney Worth. He ran 7 restaurants. It's down to 2 now. And he said they had to par down the menu because steaks don't travel 25 minutes very well, but our pastas do and that kind of thing. So you got to be smart in that regard too.
You're exactly right. And I think that, when you look at your brand and you look at your product, and steaks are a great example of this, it's really becomes a little bit of an education because everybody has their own variation of medium rare. And so understanding the travel time with that, it takes on a whole new dimension for the back of the house individuals that are preparing the food. So training is as much a part of this process as anything else. And, and operators that are making the choices to close down their restaurants or to pare back their menus, quite frankly, it's a very tough decision, but it also shows their tenacity. It shows their creativity. Looking at the menu items, looking at what's selling the most, what represents your brand the most, and protecting those items for your guests, that's as critical as understanding how much your guest is going to pay for these items to get them to their house.
How about your staff? Because working in restaurants, you get very close. It's almost, well, it's like family. You spend a lot of hours there, especially if you're the owner and the chef and the cook who's doing everything. And Rodney brought up a good point because minimum wage laws here are paid, bussers and even the tipped employees, $12, $13, $14, $15 an hour. And he said, that's killing us because we had razor thin margins, and you throw that into the mix in COVID and take out some of the tables, it really is tough.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a whole segment onto its own, is about the wage calculations and as far as what is an appropriate wage. But here's what we have seen. When obviously when March 15th, March 16th happened and folks were laid off, it became very difficult to bring back some individuals because with the additional $600 a week that they were receiving from the government, economically, it didn't make sense for the staff to come back to the restaurants when the unknown was facing them. So many just kind of hung back and waited to see, much like the restaurateurs were trying to see what was going to be the reopening policy and practice. What ended up happening for a lot of restaurateurs is they ended up having to pay higher wages to bring their staff back. And it was going to be a smaller staff with higher wages. And that's what we've seen. Does that make it harder? Well, most certainly, because you're paying more. So to offset that, we've seen a lot of restaurateurs add a COVID surcharge onto their guest check. And and if you see one, the COVID surcharge, let's say it's a 2% or 3% surcharge, that money is typically directed right to the staff. And I know in California, we've got to state, hey, where is this surcharge going? I know that we did it for a lot of the health mandates. And as long as it's fully disclosed, then that's perfectly legal. And in my opinion, perfectly fair, because we are truly all in this together.
Well, let me ask you this. How patient should a restaurant owner be? I mean, if this continues into October, November, December, I mean, after a while, you're throwing good money to bed.
That's a great point. So I'm going to loop a little bit, right? It goes back, in order for you to have patience, you've got to have calculated risks, right? Because patience without a calculated risks is there's no definition for how patient or how not patient you can be. So number one, understanding that the maximum amount of revenue that you can drive under the current conditions, that's job one. Number two is shoring up your vendors. Is the individuals that have been working with you, they clearly understand what you're going through. And for the most part, rent has been the biggest issue for most individuals because most restaurateurs don't own their buildings. So getting rent under control, and that doesn't necessarily just mean asking for free rent, but it's understanding that, hey, if your sales are off 50%, right? Going back to your landlord and working out a participatory lease, one where your landlord accepts the fact that, hey, your sales are 50% off, but as it recovers, you're willing to make up some of that rent in the additional sales. We have been doing participatory leases for clients around the country at enormous rates with a great deal of success, because once again, the landlords, it costs them a ton of money to replace a tenant. So going back to the patience question, is you're going to have as much patience as you need, but validated by the fact that you know what your sales can be and you know what your cost structure should be. So if you have a budget, that's going to allow your patience to go as far as your money will go. Without it, the two don't link up.
I was going to say, you would think landlords, because I speak of Rodney, the fellow in the East Bay here in the Bay Area, his landlord didn't really work with him. And I know a few restaurants here in the city that have gone belly up and their landlords would not work with them. And isn't it better to get some rent and have someone in your building making money as opposed to having nobody there? And who the heck's going to move in there during a pandemic?
It's really interesting. I think, and this is my personal opinion, I think landlords unwilling to work with restaurants, assuming of the fact that everything was in good standing when we started, right? So if everything was in good standing when you started, I think a landlord unwilling to work with a tenant in any capacity is short-sighted, because most landlords will tell you that the cost of refilling that space is very expensive. And doing that in the middle of a pandemic for all service-based industries is, in my opinion, a little short-sighted. When you look at what's been happening with corporate restaurants, and as you read and you see your corporate restaurant has just filed for bankruptcy for a Chapter 11 reorganization, typically that is a strategic move, and it's done to bring the landlords to the table. And because most contracts that they'll have, most rental contracts, there will allow no negotiation until there's a reason, until there's a duress reason, and that is the Chapter 11. And now, once they file Chapter 11, landlords come to the table and they can negotiate and work out either a temporary or permanent.
But the cow's out of the barn by then, for the most part.
By then, yeah, pretty much.
The restaurant guy is,
Oh, they're in the wind. That's why,
long gone.
Yeah, that's why right now, I mean, I can't say it again. Moving toward most restaurants, let's say most restaurants pay a square footage lease, right? Especially in San Francisco, and they can't afford the square footage lease. The minute their sales drop 40%. So at the end of the day, they have to move to some form of a lease structure that says, hey, look, I'm going to give you a percentage based on my sales. Now, traditionally, restaurants don't like to do that because the more they make, the more they pay. Well, in this situation, if a landlord is going to back down on the square footage rent, and let's say you're paying, I'm just going to make this up. Let's say you're paying $12,000 a month for rent, and the landlord cuts you down to $6,000 a month for rent. It's only fair that as your sales start to grow up, that there's a safe percentage of that you can give back on top of the rent back to the landlord. And that, and what we have seen is that has been a hugely successful process because it allows both hope and it allows them a strategic growth strategy back to hopefully full service.
Now let's talk PPP loans because they have certainly kept a lot of restaurants afloat, with payroll and taking care of expenses. Can restaurants survive under these conditions without another influx of loans?
In my opinion, something's got to give. All right, the PPP loans, in our opinion, looking at when we did about $380 million for our clients on PPP loans, and those are set to run out at the end of September, beginning of October. And the concern with the PPP loans is, number one, the forgiveness, and number two, where's the money going to come from? Now, let's take a step back to go forward. In the beginning, it was suggested and very directed to us that you were going to apply and receive a PPP loan, and that money was to be used for one purpose: bring back all of your staff. Now, those individuals that did that right away and followed that direction, unfortunately, that was also done under the guise of, hey, the restaurants will be back up and going here within, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks. Well, we all know that didn't happen. And so what happened to those individuals is they burned through their cash. So they are in desperate need of another round of stimulus, right? And hopefully in a grant form and not a potential loan payback. The individuals that waited and put their businesses first because they knew without the businesses, they weren't going to have the employees to bring back. Those individuals, looking at most of our clients, those individuals are fortified through the end of October, but we're still dealing with the weather that's coming in. So we really have high hopes that there will be a grant forgiveness, or pardon me, a grant rather, of the PPP loans for the third round that should hit at the end of September and beginning of October.
No crystal ball, Matt, but let's go summer 2021. Where are we restaurant-wise?
With one caveat, right? If there is a vaccine, it's going to be a free-for-all. I have high hopes that restaurants will not only be back, but they will be thriving. People we're social creatures, and we need to get out. We need to celebrate, and I really have high hopes that the restaurateurs, what this has done for a lot of them, is they have really gotten creative about profit. It is in ways that they never were before. They've now partnered with their vendors. They've partnered with third parties that can really help work with them in a financial minded situation. So I have high hopes that when we come back from this, it's going to come back like we haven't seen in a while. And those spaces that did flip over from restaurants that have contracted, they will be coming back as well, because the landlords now will have infrastructure that's built specifically for restaurants, and restaurants will have a way to grow without having the typical overhead of paying for a Class 1 hood or for grease traps or for gas lines and the infrastructure that normally is such a heavy burden on their loans.
Well, I like the way you're thinking. We can only hope that we get through this pandemic and we do get something that lies ahead that is nothing but good. Matt Vannini, he is the CEO of Restaurant Solutions. Matt, what a pleasure chatting with you. Really
appreciate your time, Frank. Thank you so much for creating a space for us today.
All right. All the best to Matt. I'm Frank Mallicoat. If you'd like more information, go to newsnowfox.com. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye now.
Stay right there, Matt. I'll just hit